Well, next to what appears to be a normalizing of relations between Armenia and Azerbaijan. On Thursday, in a joint statement, the two countries said they were working toward peace and had agreed to an exchange of prisoners of war. The apparent breakthrough comes after a decades-long dispute over the Nagorno-Karabakh region, which Azerbaijan reclaimed from Armenian separatists in September. Now, both countries have said a peace agreement could be signed by the end of the year, but peace talks mediated separately by the EU, the United States, and Russia have seen little progress. And for more on this, I'm joined by Richard Giragosian, the director of the Regional Studies Center, an independent think tank in Yerevan. Thanks so much for being with us here on France 24. What is behind this joint statement? And in your view, can Armenia and Azerbaijan reach a final agreement on peace?
Well, what's most interesting about this joint statement, which is rather unusual for both Armenia and Azerbaijan to collaborate and cooperate in such a prisoner exchange, what we see is it's dangerously incomplete. We still have a number of detainees and civilians, as well as former officials from Nagorno-Karabakh who remain in Azerbaijani captivity. It's also rather insufficient in terms of Azerbaijan's boycott of the last 4 diplomatic meetings. However, I do expect negotiations to resume on a bilateral peace treaty because of domestic politics within Azerbaijan. The Azerbaijani president has just announced snap elections for February, where the peace treaty could help him electorally.
Give us an idea of what each side is trying to achieve in this peace process.
Well, on the one hand, Armenia remains in a position of weakness with little real leverage, but it is accommodating to a very painful new post-war reality after the forced expulsion of over 100,000 Armenians from Nagorno-Karabakh. Azerbaijan, for its part, is still, unfortunately, in a position and posture of maximalist demands, including territorial threats against Armenia proper. But I do think diplomacy is the only way forward, and Azerbaijan has become increasingly isolated diplomatically. The only real step forward for any outlook of stability is a return to direct negotiations.
What has U.S. policy been with regard to this conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan, and what ultimate effect has the U.S. stance had overall in this conflict?
Well, the U.S. has long been engaged, but it is especially active in defending Armenian democracy. And most recently, after a round of diplomatic talks brokered and mediated by the Americans in Washington, there is a degree of frustration in Washington with the Azerbaijani maximalist position. But it's actually the European Union, and in particular France, that have been much more effective in bolstering Armenian security in the face of threats from Azerbaijan.
Well, now the two countries have announced that much of the peace treaty has been agreed to. What do you think are the issues that remain unresolved?
Well, I do know as a fact that over 80% of the draft text has been agreed upon. The remaining 20% in the latest version, where the Armenian side sent it to Azerbaijan, is now subject to negotiation over border delineation, border demarcation, and also the withdrawal of Azerbaijani armed forces from Armenian territory. This is both a widening of the conflict and a serious potential escalation. This, coupled with the ultimate return of all remaining Armenians in captivity in Azerbaijan. But the hardest part is over, and we do have a degree of confidence in Armenia that the democratic government has a rare commodity of legitimacy, and therefore we do see a time for statesmanship.
You made reference to this early. Azerbaijan decided to forego a meeting with its foreign minister with Armenia's back in November in Washington. What was behind that decision, and what kind of fallout has there been long term?
Well, it's actually more of a dangerous situation. The Azerbaijani president, as well as the foreign minister, have also skipped scheduled meetings in Brussels as well as Washington, in Grenada as well as Washington. What this means is a rather reckless and somewhat dangerous disregard for the need for diplomatic negotiations. Azerbaijan, unfortunately, has gotten away with relying on the force of arms. And a dangerous precedent here is Azerbaijan's victory tends to validate authoritarian power based on the use of force, which undermines Western values.
Okay, we'll have to leave it there. Richard Giragosian, the director of the Regional Study Center, an independent think tank in Yerevan. Thanks so much for joining us here on France 24.